The great white rectangle of the screen, once pockmarked and peeling, stood against the twilight sky like a freshly painted canvas waiting for a masterpiece. Below it, the gravel lot was a sea of taillights, a constellation of reds and oranges where cars full of families and teenagers and old-timers settled into their places. The smell wasn't of decay and damp earth anymore. It was of fresh popcorn, hot dogs, and the faint, sweet perfume of summer grass. A low, happy murmur hummed across the field, punctuated by the metallic clank of a speaker being hooked onto a car window. At the center of it all, the old concession stand, now a beacon of warm yellow light, buzzed with a life it had not known for 30 years. Its new neon sign, a perfect replica of the original, glowed a proud, defiant blue, the starlight. Dorothy watched it all from a small porch Frank had built onto the side of their new home, which was, in fact, the old projection booth. She was 74 years old. Her husband, Frank, 76, stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, the familiar weight of comfort she had relied on for 52 years. They had built this. Not just the repaired screen, or the functioning kitchen, or the string lights that crisscrossed the lot. They had built the sound, the smell, the feeling. They had taken a forgotten, derelict patch of land bought for $11 and turned it back into the town's beating heart. It was an impossible, ridiculous, wonderful thing. A quiet miracle born from the deepest betrayal. But to understand how a woman who spent her life balancing ledgers and a man who spent his life building cabinets for other people's homes ended up rebuilding their own lives on the grounds of an abandoned drive-in theater, you have to go back. Back to a different house, a different life. Back to the day it all ended. It began, as most tragedies do, with a promise. The house on Elm Street was more than just wood and nails. It was a living archive of their lives. The notch on the kitchen doorframe marked their son Marcus's height at age 6. A pencil line now faded but still visible. The faint stain on the living room ceiling was from the time Frank, trying to install a new light fixture, had slipped and sent a can of paint flying. The rose bushes in the backyard were Dorothy's pride, planted the year they moved in, their gnarled trunks a testament to decades of patient tending. They had bought the house with a down payment saved from Frank's first carpentry jobs and Dorothy's salary as a bookkeeper's assistant. They had paid off the mortgage 17 years ago. It was theirs. It was their fortress. Marcus sat at their kitchen table, the same one where he'd done his homework as a boy. Now he wore a suit that cost more than their monthly budget, and his smile was a bright, polished thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. He spread a glossy brochure across the worn oak. "It's the future, Mom," he said, his voice smooth and certain. "Look at this place. State of the art. A pool, a community center. No more worrying about the roof or the plumbing." The brochure showed smiling seniors playing shuffleboard and taking watercolor classes. It looked sterile, like a hospital trying to be a hotel. Frank squinted at the pictures. "We don't need a pool, Marcus. We have a garden. And this is better," Marcus insisted, tapping a photo of a pristine, modern apartment. "This is about your comfort, your security. Plus, the offer for this place, it's incredible. The developers are consolidating the whole block. You'd be set for life. More than set." The offer was indeed staggering, a number with so many zeros it felt like a misprint. Their modest 3-bedroom house, suddenly a piece of a multi-million-dollar puzzle. Dorothy traced the rim of her coffee cup. She was the observer. She saw the details Frank sometimes missed. She saw the eagerness in Marcus's eyes, an almost desperate glint that had nothing to do with their comfort and everything to do with the deal. He was a partner in the development firm. He hadn't said it outright, but she'd seen his name on the letterhead of the initial paperwork he'd shown them. His success was tied to their signature. "Where would we live?" she asked, her voice quiet. This was the linchpin of his argument. The promise. "That's the best part," he beamed, flipping the brochure over. He pointed to a blueprint. "I'm building you a granny flat, attached to my house. Your own entrance, your own kitchen, everything brand new. You'll be right there with us, with the grandkids. No more being alone over here." The thought of being near her grandchildren, of seeing them every day instead of on scheduled holidays, was a powerful lure. It was the emotional bait, and Dorothy knew it. But Frank, the doer, the man who trusted in the solidity of things, heard the promise of a new space to build, a new home to shape. He saw his son, a successful man, offering to care for them. "He's a good boy, Dottie," Frank had said later that night, as they lay in the familiar quiet of their bedroom. "He's looking out for us." Dorothy didn't answer. She listened to the house breathe around them, the groan of the pipes, the whisper of the wind in the old oak tree outside their window. She was listening to it say goodbye. They signed the papers a week later. The process was a whirlwind, managed entirely by Marcus and his team of efficient, smiling lawyers. They packed 52 years of life into cardboard boxes, a brutal archaeology of their own past. Each object, a chipped ceramic bird, a photograph of Frank in his army uniform, a box of their children's report cards, was a pang of loss. Marcus was patient, but firm. "You won't need all this stuff, Mom. The new place is modern. Clean lines." They donated most of it. They gave things away. They threw things out. They shrank their lives to fit a future they could only see in a glossy brochure. The day they left, Dorothy took one last walk through the empty rooms. The echoes were deafening. The scuff marks on the floor, the faded squares on the walls where pictures had hung for decades. They were ghosts. Frank stood by the front door, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. He looked smaller, diminished. Marcus arrived in his sleek, dark SUV. He was all efficiency and forward momentum. "All right, folks, on to the next chapter." He helped them with their suitcases. They didn't have much left. Just clothes, toiletries, and a small box of keepsakes Dorothy had refused to part with. They drove away from Elm Street without looking back. Dorothy couldn't bear to. "The new place isn't quite ready," Marcus said, his eyes on the road. "Just a few finishing touches. Permits, you know how it is. So, I've set you up somewhere comfortable for a week or two. All taken care of." He pulled into the parking lot of the Crossroads Motel, a long, low building with a flickering neon sign and peeling paint. It was not the place from the brochure. It was a transient motel by the highway, the kind of place where people didn't stay, they just stopped. "This is it?" Frank asked, his voice flat. "Just temporary, Dad. Best I could do on short notice. It's clean, and the bill's on me. I'll be back in a couple of days to check on you. Once the painters are done at my place, I'll move you in." Marcus unloaded their suitcases onto the cracked pavement. He gave Dorothy a quick, awkward hug. "You'll be great. It's an adventure." He got back in his car, and then he was gone, leaving them standing in the shadow of a buzzing sign, the roar of the highway filling the sudden, vast silence. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. The bedspread was a thin, scratchy polyester. A single window looked out onto the parking lot and the endless stream of headlights. Frank sat on the edge of one of the beds, his big, capable hands lying uselessly in his lap. "A week or two," he said, to himself more than to Dorothy. Dorothy unpacked their toiletries in the small, dim bathroom. She arranged her toothbrush and Frank's razor on the counter, a small act of order in the chaos. It was what she did. She organized. She observed. She found the patterns. The pattern here was unsettling. A week passed. They lived out of their suitcases. They ate takeout from the diner across the street. The television in the room had 3 channels that came in clearly. They watched game shows with a hollow-eyed silence. Frank tried to call Marcus every day. Most calls went to voicemail. "Hey, son, it's your dad. Just checking in on the progress." "Marcus, give us a call when you get a minute. Your mother's asking." "Son, the front desk is asking about the room. It's been a week." When Marcus finally answered, his voice was strained, rushed. "Sorry, Dad, been swamped. A snag with the inspector. These bureaucrats, you know. It'll be another week." "Hang tai." Another week bled into another. The adventure had become a purgatory. The money from the house sale was in an account that Marcus had helped them set up. He had the passwords, the checkbooks. He was managing it for them. To make things easier, they had a debit card he'd given them, with a small amount of cash for daily expenses. It felt like an allowance. One afternoon, the card was declined at the diner. Dorothy felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She called the bank herself, using the number on the back of the card. After a long time on hold, A polite but firm woman gave her the news. The main account had been emptied. A single wire transfer, made 2 weeks ago, to an overseas holding company. She hung up the phone. She didn't tell Frank right away. She sat on the lumpy motel bed and looked at the water-stained ceiling. She was the observer. She was putting the pieces together. The glossy brochure, the rushed sale, the power of attorney they had signed, trusting it was just for the house closing. The motel, the empty account. It wasn't a delay. It wasn't a snag with an inspector. It was a plan. Their son had sold their past, stolen their future, and abandoned them by the side of a highway. Frank didn't believe it at first. He raged. He denied. He called Marcus's number again and again, a frantic, desperate ritual. The number was now disconnected. He called his daughter-in-law. Her number was also disconnected. They had moved. They had vanished. The next morning, the motel manager knocked on their door. The credit card Marcus had left on file had been canceled. They had 1 hour to pay or vacate. They packed their 2 small suitcases in silence. They had a few $100s in cash between them. They had their old car, a 20-year-old sedan that rattled on the highway. And they had each other. It was all that was left. They drove away from the Crossroads Motel, joining the anonymous flow of traffic on the interstate. They had nowhere to go. They were 74 and 76 years old, and they were homeless. They were invisible. The low point was not a single moment, but a slow, grinding erosion of dignity. They spent the first few nights in the car, parked in the far corners of brightly lit 24-hour supermarket parking lots. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by the fear of a knock on the window. Frank's shoulders, once so broad and strong, seemed permanently stooped, as if carrying a weight he couldn't set down. He was a man whose identity was tied to his work, his ability to build and provide. Stripped of that, he seemed to be fading, growing transparent. Dorothy watched him, her heart aching. Her grief was quieter, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But where Frank saw only endings, Dorothy's mind, the mind of a bookkeeper, was already searching for a solution. It was a habit of a lifetime. Find the error. Balance the books. Make it make sense. This didn't make sense. It was a debt that could never be repaid, an injustice so profound it defied logic. But the problem of survival was a practical one. It had columns and figures. They had the car. They had a few $100s. They had their Social Security checks, but the next one wasn't for 2 weeks. They needed a place. Not a home, just a place. Frank wanted to go to the police. They sat in the car outside the county sheriff's office for an hour. What do we tell them, Frank? Dorothy asked gently. That our son, a successful businessman, tricked us? We signed the papers. All of them. It's a civil matter, they'll say. They won't help us. She knew this with a certainty that chilled her. They were old. They looked lost. They would be seen as confused, incompetent, a problem to be handed off to social services. She would not be a case file. Not yet. They spent their days in the public library. It was warm, it was free, and it had internet access. While Frank sat staring blankly at newspapers, Dorothy got to work. She was the observer, and her tool was information. She sat at a computer terminal, the sticky keys clicking under her methodical fingers. She didn't search for lawyers or charities. She searched for something else. She searched for property. Her logic was simple, desperate, and uniquely her own. They couldn't afford rent. They couldn't afford a down payment. They couldn't live in the car forever. Therefore, they needed to acquire a piece of land, any piece of land for almost no money, a place to simply exist, a place to put the car. She bypassed the real estate websites with their cheerful photos of unaffordable houses. She went to the source, the county tax assessor's website, a desert of spreadsheets and legal notices. She spent days learning its arcane language, cross-referencing parcel numbers and zoning codes. She was looking for the forgotten scraps, the parcels of land so undesirable, so burdened with back taxes and liens that they had fallen through the cracks of the system. And then she found it. Parcel hashtag 734B, a 6-acre commercial property on the old highway 10 miles out of town. The listing was a single, stark line of text in a long, dense table of tax-delinquent properties scheduled for auction. Owner, Starlight Theaters Incorporated defunct. Back taxes owed, $4,321. Minimum bid, the cost of filing the deed transfer. $11. There was no picture, just a satellite map showing a large, pale, fan-shaped clearing surrounded by overgrown woods. A ghost of a place. Dorothy felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope exactly, more like curiosity, a problem to be solved. She turned to Frank. His face was gray in the fluorescent library light. "Frank," she said, keeping her voice even. "I think I found something." She showed him the screen. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. "A drive-in theater," he said. The words sounded absurd. "Dottie, it's a ruin. It's been closed since I was a young man." "It's 6 acres, Frank, and it's $11. It's nothing. Weeds and a rotten screen." "What are we going to do with a rotten screen?" he asked, the despair in his voice a raw, open wound. Dorothy looked at the satellite image again. She zoomed in on the small, square building near the entrance. The concession stand and projection booth. A structure. A roof. "The screen is still standing, Frank," she said softly. It was a ridiculous thing to say, but it was the only thing she could think of. A thing that was broken but not gone. That's a start. He looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time in days. He saw the quiet, unshakable resolve in her eyes. The same look she'd had when she decided they were going to buy the house on Elm Street all those years ago. The look that said, "I have balanced the columns, and this is the only answer that adds up." He was the doer. He needed a thing to do. For weeks, there had been nothing. Now here was a thing. An insane, impossible thing. But it was a thing. He slowly nodded. "All right, Dottie. $11. The next day, they drove to the county courthouse. It was a place of imposing stone and hushed hallways. They felt small and out of place in their worn clothes. Dorothy held the paperwork she had printed at the library, her hands steady. She walked up to the clerk's window. The woman behind the glass looked at them over her spectacles, her expression bored. "We're here to pay the fee for parcel 734B, Dorothy said, her voice clear and firm. The clerk typed the number into her computer. Her eyebrows shot up. "The old drive-in? Honey, are you sure? It's a wreck. Probably condemned." "We're sure," Dorothy said. She slid a $10 bill and a $1 bill onto the glass. The clerk shrugged, stamped a pile of papers with a loud, satisfying thud, and slid a deed back to them. "It's your headache now." They walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, holding a single piece of paper that said they owned 6 acres of derelict land and the ghosts of 1,000 summer nights. Frank drove. He didn't say a word. He followed the old highway out of town, the road cracking and sprouting weeds. They passed the last of the suburban developments, then the last of the farms. The landscape grew wilder, and then they saw it. A rusted, skeletal sign frame stood by the side of the road. The letters that once spelled out STRLIGHT long gone, surrendered to rust and thieves. A gravel driveway, almost completely reclaimed by nature, led through a thicket of overgrown trees. Frank turned the car in, the suspension groaning as they bumped over the uneven ground. The driveway opened up into the lot. It was worse than they had imagined. The speaker posts stood in crooked, silent rows like a mechanical cemetery. Their wires were gone, their heads smashed or stolen. The ground was a carpet of weeds, broken glass, and sun-bleached trash. At the far end, the screen loomed, its white surface a peeling, gray mess like sunburnt skin. It was streaked with rust and graffiti, but it was standing, just as Dorothy had said. In the center of it all was the concession stand. It was a flat-roofed, concrete block building, its windows boarded up, its paint blistered. A faded mural of a dancing hot dog and soda cup was barely visible on one wall. Frank stopped the car in the middle of the lot and killed the engine. The silence that rushed and was absolute, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the tall weeds. "Well," he said, his voice heavy, "we own a dump." Dorothy didn't say anything. She got out of the car. She was the observer. She was assessing. The weeds could be cut. The trash could be cleared. The building was the key. She walked towards it, her shoes crunching on the gravel. She pulled at one of the boards covering a window. It was soft with rot and came away in her hand. She peered into the darkness inside. The air that wafted out was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and time. Frank came up behind her. He had a tire iron in his hand, taken from the trunk of the car. Without a word, he began to pry the boards off the main door. The wood groaned and splintered. After a minute of hard work, the door swung inward with a screech of rusty hinges. They stood on the threshold, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom. The interior was a disaster. The concession counter was still there, covered in a thick layer of grime and debris. Old popcorn boxes and syrup containers lay scattered on the floor. In the back, a narrow set of stairs led up to the projection booth. Frank walked in, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He ran a hand along a concrete wall. He stamped his foot on the floor. It was solid. Concrete slab. "Good bones," he muttered, almost to himself. The first words of hope he'd spoken in a month. He was the doer, and he had found something to do. He looked at Dorothy, a flicker of his old self in his eyes. "It's a mess, Dottie. A god-awful mess." "Yes, it is," she agreed. She walked past him and began picking up some of the larger pieces of trash, creating a small, clear space on the floor. "Let's get to work." That first week was a brutal education in the physics of decay. They worked from sunrise to sunset, fueled by cheap coffee and sandwiches they bought at a gas station miles down the road. They slept in the car, parked beside the concession stand, too exhausted to be afraid. Their first task was to make a space livable. Frank, with the small set of tools he'd always kept in his trunk, was a man reborn. The stoop in his shoulders straightened. The hesitation in his movements vanished, replaced by the sure, economic motions of a craftsman. He was building again. He was saving them. He focused on the projection booth upstairs. It was a small, square room with 2 rectangular openings overlooking the field. It was filthy, but it was dry. They swept out decades of dust and mouse droppings. Frank used the rotten wood he'd pried from the windows to board up the projection ports, sealing them against the wind. He found an old metal cot frame and used the back seat of their car to fashion a crude mattress. It was their first bed. Downstairs, Dorothy waged a war against the grime. She hauled bucket after bucket of water from a spigot they'd found on the back of the building. To their astonishment, after Frank tightened a few fittings with his wrench, it worked, sputtering out cold, rust-colored water that eventually ran clear. She scrubbed the floors, the walls, the counter. She was reclaiming the space, inch by painful inch. She was balancing the ledger, turning a negative into a zero from which they could start a build. They created a small living area in one corner of the concession stand. They used old, discarded pallets they found behind the building as a subfloor to keep them off the cold concrete. A couple of overturned buckets served as chairs. An old metal drum, cleaned and ventilated, became a makeshift stove for heat and for boiling water. It was primitive. It was camping indoors. But it was theirs. Their money was dwindling fast. They ate canned soup and bread. The work was slow, hampered by their age and their lack of resources. Frank's hands, once so nimble, were now stiff with arthritis. Dorothy's back ached constantly. Some nights, they would sit by their little barrel stove, too tired to speak, and wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. But every morning, they would wake up, and the screen would still be standing. It became their symbol. As long as it stood, so would they. The day they met Earl was the day things began to change. They needed nails, and screws, and a new saw blade. Frank's was worn down to a nub. Their cash was almost gone. They drove into the nearby town of Harmony Creek, a place they knew only from the road signs. It was a small, sleepy town, the kind of place that time had largely bypassed. Its main street had a diner, a post office, and a hardware store. Hobbs Hardware, the sign read in faded red letters. If we don't have it, you don't need it. The inside smelled of sawdust, oil, and old-fashioned competence. It was a labyrinth of shelves stacked high with everything imaginable. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he had been carved from the same oak as the floorboards. He was about their age, with a thick mane of white hair, a flannel shirt, and a deeply skeptical expression. This was Earl Hobbs. Frank laid their meager list on the counter. A box of roofing nails, a handsaw blade, and a roll of tar paper. Earl looked at the list, then at Frank and Dorothy. He saw their dusty clothes, their work-worn hands, the exhaustion in their faces. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "You the folks who bought the old Starlight property?" he asked, his voice a low grumble. News traveled fast in a small town. "That's us," Frank said. Earl grunted. "Heard someone paid the back taxes. Figured it was some developer from the city. Didn't figure it'd be." He trailed off, not wanting to say the word old. "We're fixing it up," Dorothy said simply. "Making it our home." Earl leaned on the counter, his skepticism warring with a flicker of curiosity. "Fixing it up? That place is a tear down. Roof shot, full of rot. The walls are solid concrete block," Frank countered, the pride of a builder in his voice. "And the foundation is sound. We're patching the roof now." Earl looked from Frank's determined face to Dorothy's quiet dignity. He had seen a lot of people in his 70-plus years. He knew desperation when he saw it, but he also knew grit. He saw something in them that was not asking for a handout. They were customers. They were workers. He gathered their items. The total came to $42. Dorothy counted out the last of their cash. They were a few dollars short. A flush of shame crept up her neck. Earl saw it. He looked at the meager pile of bills, then back at them. He made a decision. "Tell you what," he said, pushing the money back toward them. "You're going to need more than this. You'll need lumber, insulation, wire. You can't do a job like that piecemeal." He pulled out a ledger book from under the counter, an actual book with paper pages and handwritten entries. He opened it to a fresh page. "I'll set you up an account," he said, not looking at them, as if embarrassed by the gesture. "You pay me when you can. I've seen your work," he added, though he hadn't. "I know you're good for it." Frank and Dorothy stood there, stunned into silence. It was the first act of pure, unprompted kindness they had received since their world had fallen apart. It wasn't charity. It was a vote of confidence, a professional courtesy from one old-timer to another. We don't know what to say," Frank stammered. "Don't say anything," Earl grumbled, already writing their names at the top of the page. "Just do good work, and bring me a list of what you really need." They left the store not just with nails and a saw blade, but with lumber, insulation, and a roll of proper roofing material loaded into the back of their car. They left with something far more valuable, an ally. They were no longer invisible. Someone had seen them. The arrival of their first Social Security check was a quiet cause for celebration. They drove to Hobbs Hardware and paid Earl the first installment on their account. He just nodded and made a note in his ledger. The transaction solidified their pact. With proper materials, the work accelerated. Frank was in his element. He repaired the roof, a slow, painstaking process that left him aching every night, but he did it with a master's touch. He framed interior walls, creating a small, functional layout within the concession stand, a tiny kitchen area, a bathroom, and a small living space. He was no longer just patching. He was building. Dorothy, meanwhile, took on the grounds. She bought a scythe from Earl and began the monumental task of clearing the weeds. It was backbreaking work. She filled countless trash bags with the debris of a generation. With every patch of ground she cleared, it felt like she was clearing her own mind, cutting away the tangled mess of betrayal and grief to find solid earth beneath. One afternoon, as she was wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of thorny vines, a beat-up car pulled into the driveway and stopped. A young woman got out. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was visibly pregnant, and her face was etched with a weariness that went far beyond her years. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small. Is it okay if I park here? Just for the night. My car's acting up. I won't be any trouble." Dorothy looked at her. She saw the fear in the young woman's eyes, the faint bruise on her cheek she tried to hide with her hair. She saw a story of flight, of desperation. She saw a reflection of herself just a few months prior. "Of course," Dorothy said, without hesitation. "You can park right over there. Are you hungry? I was just about to make some soup." The young woman's name was Chloe. She had run away from an abusive boyfriend in a town 2 states over. She had been living in her car for a week. She had seen the activity at the old drive-in and, thinking it was just an abandoned lot, hoped to find a safe place to rest for a night. She stayed for more than a night. The next morning, Chloe was up early, helping Dorothy pull weeds. She didn't say much, but she worked with a quiet, fierce energy. That evening, Frank shared their simple meal with her. No one asked any questions. They just accepted her presence. Chloe became the first citizen of their fledgling community. She was young and strong, and her energy was a boon. She helped with the heavy lifting, with the painting, with the endless cleaning. In return, Frank and Dorothy gave her a safe place to be. Frank fixed the rattle in her car's engine. Dorothy made sure she was eating properly. They didn't talk about it. They just became a strange, multi-generational family of 3. A month later, Leo arrived. He was even younger than Chloe, maybe 18. He carried a guitar case and a small duffel bag. He had been kicked out of his home after telling his parents he was gay. He'd been sleeping at a friend's house, but had worn out his welcome. He'd heard from someone in town about the old people living at the drive-in. He came looking not for a handout, but for work. "I can do anything," he said, standing before Frank, trying to look tough and failing. "I'll sweep, I'll haul trash, anything, just for a place to pitch a tent." Frank looked at the boy's soft hands and his scared eyes. He saw another piece of discarded humanity, just like them. "You know how to use a hammer?" Frank asked. "No, sir," Leo admitted. "I can teach you," Frank said. And so, the family grew to 4. Leo was a quick learner. Frank, who had never been a patient teacher with his own son, found a deep satisfaction in passing on his skills to this boy. He taught him how to measure twice and cut once, how to frame a wall, how to hang a door. Under Frank's tutelage, Leo's awkwardness transformed into a quiet competence. He helped Frank finish the interior of the concession stand, turning it from shelter into a real, albeit tiny home. The drive-in was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of hammers, of Chloe's soft singing as she worked, of Leo's tentative guitar chords in the evenings. Dorothy managed their small ecosystem. She organized the work, managed their meager budget, and planned their meals. They pooled their resources. Chloe's part-time waitressing job in town, Leo's occasional earnings from playing his guitar on a street corner, and Frank and Dorothy's social security. It was a small, self-sustaining world. They cleared the entire lot. They repaired the fence that surrounded the property. Frank and Leo even began the painstaking work of patching and painting the giant screen, one small section at a time. They weren't trying to reopen the theater. They were just fixing what was broken. It was a matter of pride. The town of Harmony Creek began to take notice. People driving by would slow down, surprised to see the old ruin being brought back to life. Earl, at the hardware store, became their unofficial advocate. "They're good people," he'd tell his customers. "Hard workers, paying their bill every month." People started to help in small ways. A farmer dropped off a box of fresh vegetables. The owner of the diner sent over a container of leftover stew. It wasn't charity, it was neighborliness, an old currency the town still traded in. The Starlight was becoming a part of the community again, even before it was anything more than a construction site. Dorothy felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. She had lost a house, but she had found a home. She had lost a son, but she had found a family. The ledger was, in its own strange way, beginning to balance. But the world outside their fence had its own set of ledgers, its own rules, and they were about to come calling. The man from the county arrived on a Tuesday morning. He drove a white official car that seemed glaringly out of place parked on the gravel lot. He wore a crisp shirt with a government logo and carried a clipboard, the universal symbol of bureaucratic trouble. His name was Henderson. He looked around at their tidy, work-in-progress world with an expression of profound disapproval. He saw the patched roof, the newly painted trim on the concession stand, the neat vegetable garden Chloe had started near the back fence. He didn't see resilience. He saw violations. "I'm from the Code Enforcement Office," he announced, his voice devoid of warmth. "We've had a complaint." A complaint. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Dorothy wondered who would complain. A passing motorist? A developer who had also had their eye on the property? Or perhaps, and this thought was a cold stone in her gut, her son Marcus had somehow found them. Henderson walked around the concession stand, making notes on his clipboard. Unpermitted dwelling, improper sanitation hookups, unsafe electrical wiring. This is a commercial property, not a residence. You can't live here. We own the land, Frank said, his voice tight. Leo and Chloe stood behind him, a silent, worried chorus. Owning the land doesn't give you the right to ignore the law, Henderson retorted. He tore a sheet from his clipboard and tacked it to the door Frank had so carefully built. It was a notice of condemnation. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, the county would demolish the structure at their expense. 30 days. The words were a death sentence. After Henderson left, a heavy silence fell over the drive-in. All the progress, all the hope they had built, seemed to crumble in the face of that single piece of paper. Frank stared at it, his face ashen. Leo kicked at the gravel, his newfound confidence shattered. Chloe wrapped her arms around her stomach, as if to protect her unborn child from the coming storm. But Dorothy was the observer. She did not panic. She read the notice, every word, every clause. She saw the regulations, the code cited. It was another set of books that needed to be balanced. He's not wrong, Frank, she said quietly. We did this all without permits. We didn't know how, but that doesn't mean it can't be fixed. That evening, as if summoned by the crisis, another car pulled into the drive-in. This one was a sleek, dark sedan, just like the one Marcus had driven. And when he stepped out, Dorothy's worst fear was realized. It was her son. Marcus looked older, more tired than she remembered. The polish was gone, replaced by a frayed, anxious energy. He took in the scene, the patched-up building, the ragged-looking young people standing with his parents, and his face twisted in a mask of horror and embarrassment. My God, he breathed. It's true. I got a call from a former associate in the county office. He said you were squatting in a derelict theater. I didn't believe it. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to manage a public relations crisis. His crisis. What were you thinking? He demanded, his voice rising. Living like this? With these street kids? After everything I did for you. Frank took a step forward, his fists clenched. What you did for us. You robbed us, Marcus. You left us to die in a motel. I hit a rough patch. Marcus shouted, his composure finally breaking. The deal went south. I was trying to protect the money. I was going to come back for you. I was going to make it right. The words were hollow, self-serving, and everyone knew it. He turned to Dorothy, his eyes pleading. Mom, listen to me. This has to stop. It's a disgrace. I found a place for you. A nice retirement community. It's clean. It's safe. I'll pay for the first 6 months. We can put this all behind us. We can tell people you were on a long vacation. He didn't get it. He was still trying to package them, to hide them, to manage them. He looked at their home, the place they had built from nothing with their own hands, and saw only a mess that needed to be cleaned up. Dorothy looked her son in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was not angry. It was calm, level, and devastating in its simplicity. This is our home, Marcus, she said. These are our friends. You are the one who is a disgrace. She turned her back on him and walked toward the concession stand. The conversation was over. Marcus stood there for a long moment, his mouth open, unable to comprehend his dismissal. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he got back in his car and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. His visit, however, had an unintended effect. It solidified their resolve. They were no longer just fighting for a place to live. They were fighting for their home, for their family, for their dignity. The community, both the one inside the fence and the one outside, began to rally. Dorothy went to see Earl. She laid the condemnation notice on his counter. He read it, his lips a thin, grim line. Henderson, he grunted, bureaucrat with a capital B, thinks the world runs on paperwork. But Earl also knew the rules. He pulled out dusty code books from under his counter, books that hadn't been opened in years. He and Dorothy sat at a small table in the back of the store for hours, poring over zoning laws and building regulations. There's a loophole, Earl said, tapping a page with his finger. Agricultural homestead exemption. If you're using more than 50% of the land for cultivation, the dwelling requirements are different, less stringent. Chloe, hearing this, had an idea. She had made friends in town. She knew people. She went to the local farmer's market and told their story. She didn't ask for money. She asked for seedlings, for soil, for help. The response was a quiet flood. People showed up. The farmer who had dropped off vegetables brought his tiller and helped them turn over an entire acre of the lot. The garden club from the next town donated hundreds of starter plants. People came with shovels and hoes and bags of manure. Within a week, the gravel lot was transformed. Neat rows of corn, squash, tomatoes, and beans stretched from the concession stand almost to the giant screen. It was an instant farm. Meanwhile, Frank and Leo, guided by Earl's knowledge of the code book, worked frantically on the building. They replaced the makeshift wiring with proper, grounded electrical. They installed a new septic tank, a huge expense that ate up all their savings, but it was necessary. Earl extended their credit without a second thought. They installed smoke detectors and fire extinguishers. They made sure every nail, every joint was up to code. The story spread through Harmony Creek. The local newspaper, a small weekly publication, sent a reporter. She interviewed Dorothy and Frank, Chloe and Leo. She took pictures of their home, their garden, their work. The article was published on the front page. Starlight Pioneers. Family fights county to save their unlikely home. The town was on their side. The condemnation notice on their door became a symbol of defiance. Someone left a bouquet of flowers next to it. Another left a bag of groceries. They were no longer the strange old people at the drive-in. They were part of the town. They were Harmony Creek's own. The 30 days passed in a blur of frantic work and quiet determination. On the final day, the day of the inspection, the air was thick with tension. Henderson was due at 10 a.m. By 9:30, a small crowd had gathered. Earl was there, his arms crossed, his code book tucked under his arm. The reporter from the paper was there, with a photographer. Several of the farmers and townspeople who had helped them stood silently by the fence, a quiet show of support. Henderson arrived exactly on time, his face a mask of official impartiality. He seemed surprised by the crowd, and even more surprised by the transformation of the property. He walked through the massive garden, his polished shoes getting dusty. He made no comment. He started his inspection. He was meticulous, thorough, checking every outlet, every pipe, every support beam. Frank followed him, answering his technical questions in a calm, professional voice. Leo stood by, ready to fix anything that was found wanting. Inside, Henderson looked at the small, tidy home they had created. Dorothy had everything spotless. He checked the fire extinguisher, the ventilation, the plumbing. He made notes on his clipboard. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he stood on the small porch, looking out over the field, the garden, the crowd. The entire future of this place, this family, rested on his decision. He turned to Dorothy and Frank. "The agricultural use is substantial," he said, his voice clipped. "The dwelling meets the minimum safety requirements for that classification. All violations have been abetted." He pulled a pen from his pocket, and with a series of decisive clicks, he signed off on the inspection form and stamped it. He handed the copy to Dorothy. Approved. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over Dorothy. She looked at Frank and saw tears welling in his eyes. Chloe let out a sob of joy. The crowd by the fence broke into spontaneous applause. Henderson gave a curt nod, his job done. But as he turned to leave, he paused. He looked at the concession stand, then at the giant, newly painted screen. "You know," he said, a flicker of something almost human in his voice. "My father took me here to see a movie once. A long time ago. Then he got in his car and drove away." The victory was quiet, but absolute. The newspaper ran a follow-up story, a triumphant tale of community spirit over bureaucracy. The article was picked up by a regional news network. The story of the old couple who bought a drive-in for $11 and started a farm became a minor sensation. The publicity had consequences. For Marcus, it brought a wave of public shame. His name was mentioned in the articles. His betrayal, once a private, secret thing, was now public knowledge. His business partners distanced themselves. His carefully constructed life began to unravel. For the Starlight, it brought a new wave of support. A retired projectionist from a neighboring town called, offering to help them get the old equipment running. A local cinema, upgrading to digital, donated an old but functional film projector. Cans of old movies, classics, cartoons, B-movies, began showing up, donated by collectors who had read the story. An idea began to take shape. An idea that had seemed impossible just months ago. "We could show a movie," Chloe said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Just for the town, to say thank you." And so they did. They chose a warm Saturday night in late summer. They spread the word through the town. Free admission. Bring your own chairs. Popcorn for $1. They didn't know if anyone would come. By dusk, the lot was full. It was a mirror image of the scene Dorothy had held in her mind for months. Cars and people filled the space they had so painstakingly cleared. The murmur of happy voices replaced the whisper of the wind in the weeds. Frank and Leo, with the help of the retired projectionist, threaded the film. Chloe and Dorothy worked the concession stand, which was now a real, functioning kitchen. At exactly 9 o'clock, Frank flipped a switch. For the first time in 30 years, the neon sign of the Starlight sputtered, buzzed, and glowed to life, casting a warm blue light over the happy crowd. A cheer went up. Then, the projector whirred. A beam of light shot across the lot, and a black and white image flickered onto the giant screen. Dorothy stood on her porch, next to Frank, and watched the faces of her town, her community, her family, all bathed in the magical glow of the movie. They had done it. They had not just built a home. They had brought the Starlight back to life. The seasons turned. The first harvest from the garden was bountiful. They sold the surplus at a small stand by the road, and the money went back into improving the Starlight. They built 2 more tiny cabins at the edge of the property, using salvaged lumber, creating homes for Chloe and her new baby girl, Lily, and for Leo. The drive-in became a true homestead, a sanctuary for the lost and found. Movie nights became a weekly tradition. They charged a small amount, enough to cover the costs and continue their work. The Starlight became the heart of Harmony Creek again, a place where people gathered not just to watch a film, but to be together. One afternoon, a car Dorothy didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. It was not a slick, expensive sedan. It was a modest family car. A woman got out. It was her daughter-in-law, Marcus's estranged wife. She had Lily's cousins, Dorothy's other grandchildren, with her. She looked tired and sad, but her eyes were clear. She apologized for her silence, for her complicity, for not standing up to Marcus. She explained that she had left him. The public shame had been the final straw, revealing a rotten core she could no longer ignore. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, just for her children to know their grandparents. Dorothy looked at the 2 young children, who stared with wide eyes at the giant movie screen. She saw her son's features in their faces, but without the shadow of his ambition. She simply nodded toward the concession stand. "The door's open," she said. "I was just making lemonade." It was a beginning, a slow, tentative mending. Marcus never came back. His absence was a hole that would never quite be filled, but the life growing around it was so vibrant, so full, that the emptiness became smaller every day. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Frank taught Leo and some of the other young people in town the basics of carpentry and mechanics. Dorothy, with Chloe's help, managed the garden and the drive-in's finances. Her ledgers now filled with income from popcorn sales and tomato harvests instead of the bitter calculus of survival. One evening, late in the fall, after the last movie of the season, Frank and Dorothy sat alone on their porch. The lot was empty and quiet. A cool breeze rustled the dry stalks in the garden. Frank had placed a single, solar-powered lamp at the base of the giant screen, so that even when there was no movie, it had a soft, gentle glow. He reached over and took her hand. His was calloused and strong. Hers was veined and steady. "We did all right, Dottie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dorothy looked out at their kingdom of salvaged dreams. She saw the little house they had built. She saw the cabins where their new family slept. She saw the garden, resting for the winter, but promising a new season of life. She saw the great white screen, standing tall and solid against the starry sky. It was no longer a symbol of what was broken. It was a monument to what they had built. She squeezed his hand. A lifetime of love and partnership and resilience passed between them in that simple gesture. It was all the answer he needed. The light on the screen was a permanent, quiet beacon, a promise that even in the deepest darkness, you could still build a place to call home.